Welcome back to The Quest, an extraordinary journey where every step brings us closer to discovering God's love for us. Want to join the conversation? Give us a call at 877-757-9424.
All right, we are back, and there's an article over at Catholic Vote, and I just read some of it, and we'll start commenting on it. I think as we set our sights towards the coming conclave, I think we do have to accept the fact that the Church currently is quite divided right now. And there's a history to that, both longer than Francis, but as I say, this pontificate has brought out those divisions as perhaps never before. So here's what the article says. This is from the news feed from the Catholic Vote. According to one of the most authoritative lay voices, the Catholic Church stands at a crossroads marked by unprecedented polarization and internal debate in the wake of Pope Francis' death. This is the take of Gian Vian, a historian, journalist, and former director of the Vatican newspaper L'Osservatore Romano, offered in a candid and critical interview with the Chilean daily La Tercera. Vian is a leading Vatican expert, having directed the Vatican newspaper, L'Osservatore Romano, for over a decade, providing him a unique coverage and vantage point on papal leadership and the inner workings of the Holy See. Notably, it was Pope Francis himself who requested Vian's resignation, a move that Vian now describes as fortuitous, given subsequent changes that reduced the newspaper's autonomy. All right. So he was his period overlapped Benedict and Francis. It was the time where he was there. He characterizes Francis as a pope who had good intentions, but his achievements have been incomplete and at times contradictory, and argues that the exercise of papal power under Francis has highlighted the urgent need for reform. Again, he goes on to say that there's a lot for us to consider in terms of the papacy itself. And so, I don't know, we'll just stop here for a minute, Matthew, and I just want to say that I think that there have been warnings, I think, from some in the both laity but also among the clergy, that if they go too far to the left to pick a pope, that this could really result in a kind of a de facto, if not de jure, schism. That this could be a moment where we're either going to recover a kind of a connection with the papacy, or we're going to cement the divisions. And I don't know, they may be too dramatic, but I do think it would be extremely discouraging to be kind of still in the same soup, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really foresee a true schism coming along. I think if anyone who was upset with Pope Francis, they would have left during Pope Francis. It just depends if, how extreme, someone who comes in might be. I think Cardinal Mueller nailed it the best when he talked about, the next pope really needs to be orthodox. Mm-hmm. And he said he doesn't like using liberal or conservative, and I agree with him on that. Yeah. But it's just orthodox, holding to what the church has always taught. That's just, to me, it's so obvious. And I think where Pope Francis missed the mark was his clarity on things, because he was opposed to abortion and this transgenderism and some of these other things, but then he was just vague in other areas. And I don't think that helped the church, because we're looking to him as our shepherd, as our leader. So I think we want someone with a lot of clarity.
Clarity.
And if we don't get that, then that's going to cause more problems. I don't see new problems. I just see continuing the same old problems that we're dealing with right now, if that makes sense.
Sure. Well, again, I think, at some point, orthodoxy is the key point, and that sounds like a conservative position to take these days. It shouldn't. Because if you just look at our political situation here in America, true Catholic orthodoxy is going to kind of be an equal offender and an equal pleaser. There's going to just simply be certain things which upset the right and the left in this country. So, for example, our position on immigration would be a little left of center, but I think we clearly enunciate the need for a secure border. but maybe more generosity than some would like in receiving immigrants. Same thing with the death penalty. That's going to be kind of on the left, but on the right, of course, abortion is and the whole all the marriage things and that have come up, and all those things would be kind of on the right of center, including physician-assisted suicide. All these things make us so, but somewhere in the middle of all this is where we are. In other words, we have clear views on these topics that may fit well into one party or another, but we don't fit into one party ourselves, and I would think that we have to. So I think it's an important distinction you made, Matthew, that orthodoxy is the key point, and maybe this followed right behind with clarity. Because when we sort of fumble it, or we kind of give two different signals, we say, well, abortion is murder, but then we place three people who are pro-abortion on the papal life commission. Well, what are we saying here? So, we get confused, we get a little bit lost, and so on rather quickly. So again, all of these are just ways of saying that I think we want that. I also have to say, though, I really do worry. Some of these things that we're going through in the church right now, people have really about had it up to here, mostly on the right. And I am a little concerned that, excuse me, I am concerned that if they pick a pope who's too far to the left, there's some names going on. I don't want to repeat names. I just want to say that I think if it's too far to the left, there could be some who are just, that's it, I'm just tuning out. We're going to just do our thing. And I hope there won't be formal schism, but I think there could be a practical schism where the Pope just becomes a distant figure to some who they won't listen one way or the other. But we'll see. That's a truism, I know.
Well, going back to my sort of clarity and unity statement, you look at like in the country and the reaction to the death of the Pope, right? Mm-hmm. Loved or disliked. Mm-hmm. Every place had their flag at half-mast. Disney World had its flag at half-mast. Mm-hmm. And it's almost that the world knows that the Pope is this very important leader, whether people are Catholic or not. Yeah. And so it's such an opportunity if we could get someone. I'm also not going to name names, but I have my hopefuls, which I know are very unrealistic. Mm-hmm. But just. I feel like the world is at such a crossroads right now with all things. Globalism is sort of dying, and some nationalism is sort of coming into place. And there's the pushback against the extreme woke ideology is sort of reversing itself. Yeah. We've seen young people coming into the church. We're seeing Protestants converting to the church. So it's a great time of a great shift. And I just pray that the Lord blesses us with the Pope. Not that we deserve, but the Pope that we need right now, because it could just be amazing. It could be a really, really amazing thing for the whole world, for Catholics and non-Catholics alike. Yeah,
just have that
leadership.
Of the Spirit,
Right, yeah.
There's very clearly a movement of the Spirit right now in this country. I can't say it's everywhere in the world, but I do know that the young people who are coming, they seek clarity in doctrine. They're not all necessarily going to the TLM, but I think they prefer a liturgy that's less in their face, and so on. But liturgy aside, I think that the Protestants who are coming over again, they need the church to be clear. They're coming out of an even murkier situation where some of these evangelical churches reinvent themselves every 90 days. And certainly Protestantism is collapsing. But I suppose we should take it as a compliment, too, shouldn't we, Matthew, that everybody's looking, what's going on in Rome with that conclave? Who's going to...
Right, yeah.
Nobody says that when the Archbishop of Canterbury dies. Right. Or when, the head of the Methodist Church, whoever that is, So there's something unique about the Catholic Church. We're hated above all others, and yet, in a way, we're more fascinated. We're more of an object of fascination, even to our enemies, and certainly to just those who are indifferent. So we should take it as a compliment. I think there is a powerful affirmation that there's just something about the Catholic Church. And when I say Catholic, I don't just mean the Roman Catholic. I'm thinking of all the different rites, the Eastern rites, all of these things that make up the whole Catholic Church throughout the world. So there's just something powerful there, and something about really worth praying for, because as we're saying here, that this isn't just for the Catholic Church. I think it's for the whole world. Right now the world needs, especially the Western world, needs a lot of moral clarity that we need to be able to provide right now, that certain things just simply cannot be. And certain things have to be understood as helpful to human progress, and some not. And these are the kinds of things where a strong, unflinching voice that's charitable but clear. And I think that's going to be, I personally think, very important, not just for the church, yes, for the church, but also for the world. That somebody, and I think a lot of people I know in some of the more liberal Protestant churches say, I'm kind of glad the Catholic Church still holds the line.
Yeah.
Because when our little experiments are over, we'll have a baseline to go back to. I'm like, all right, I'll take that, So as I say, I think somewhere in there, maybe you might say we're called to be the adult in the room with all these social experiments.
Well, we are the oldest in the room, so that kind of makes
true.
us the adult.
You're right, man. Make it plain, my friend. Make it plain. So when it comes to the conclave, I would want to caution our listeners, keep yourself on a little bit of a diet when it comes to digesting all the news about the latest, Cardinal Parolin this, we heard he had a health setback, and what's that all about? What does it mean for the politics? And does this move shift here? Does that move shift there? And be careful. Your head's going to explode if you try to take in all of that. And you'll also be anxious and worried. The better thing is to, you can stay a little informed, like we're trying to do right here with you, but at the end of the day, try to keep a little bit of a distance from all that, because it shifts from moment to moment, and all these people running around with their expert notions probably don't know half of what they're talking about. I think another commentator said something. If somebody tells you they're pretty sure they know who the next pope is going to be, they're not only lying to you, they're lying to themselves. There are some very unusual things. For example, I was talking to somebody today. When Bergoglio was elected Pope Francis, his name wasn't being bandied around, as I recall, back during that synod. I don't recall ever hearing his name. Maybe it was mentioned by someone in passing, but I said, well, who's that? And, just dropped it. But he had actually run second in the when Ratzinger was elected Pope Benedict. He'd actually been the second runner-up. And it's surprising, all these, aficionados who, claim they know all this kind of stuff didn't even consider him that highly ranked. And I was like, well, wow. And so I'm just trying to say, looking back on it, you're like, all these people said they knew all this stuff, and they don't even take into an account that Jorge Bergoglio was the second runner-up after Benedict in that particular conclave. Now, we're not supposed to know that, Matthew. These things are supposed to be kept secret. But sadly, they're not. People do rat it out. But that said, it was a known fact, and so on. And I think that later, after the conclave that elected Cardinal Bergoglio, Cardinal McCarrick was out kind of boasting of how he had moved a lot of people to vote for Bergoglio and different stuff like that. He shouldn't have been telling us that then, but he was. But of course, we came to find out he had some other issues to deal with as well. So, but again, I would just encourage everybody, try your very best to stay generally aware, prayerfully aware. But if you go deep into the commentariat, you're going to find, I think, you're going to get very anxious very quickly, especially if you have strong feelings about who you think should be elected. And so we'll leave it at that. I want to be careful not even to say who I'm kind of rooting for right now. I can say Matthew. I mean, you've already mentioned. I would certainly like Sarah. I don't think it's likely, given what we said earlier. But maybe Cardinal Pizzaballa, for no other reason than one day we can say Papa Pizzaballa. All right. Well, we'll see how it all unfolds. And when we return, we're going to talk a little bit about an article about communion in the hand versus communion in the tongue.
This is Life News Radio. I'm Jim Anderson. Texas senators Thursday sent the state House key legislation to stop mail-order abortions. The House will be busy with that bill and others ranging from banning abortion trafficking to other states, conscience protections for health workers, and funding obstetric training to help provide robust care for women alongside state abortion law. The House has less than a month to prepare laws for Governor Abbott's signature, and 2 more local governments in East Texas have outlawed abortion activity. Renewed focus is falling on chemical abortion after new research uncovered huge dangers for women. Pro-life groups are pressuring President Trump and calling out feminists for seemingly ignoring the latest studies. This is Life News Radio. The View, the accurate view of the human person, changes everything. The news you hear and see pertaining to the human person has the power to inform or misinform your opinions and what you do with the gift of life and what you allow your government to do. It's why we at this station offer news on the life issue. We hope you will carefully assess what you hear, read, and view. This is Life News Radio. The Trump White House Department of Justice is preparing to aggressively prosecute recent years' anarchy and violence targeting churches and pregnancy centers. The FACE Act was supposed to protect these places, but the previous administration disproportionately prosecuted peaceful pro-life protest. And President Trump's nomination of Catholic Vote President Brian Birch as Vatican ambassador has been advanced to the full Senate. Democrats have not been showing up for work to slow down nominations. The placing of our new ambassador close to the election of a new pope is expected to emphasize the importance of U.S.-Vatican relations. For pro-life headlines delivered to your email address daily, sign up at lifenews.com. This has been Life News Radio.
You're listening to The Quest, a pilgrimage of faith. Have a question or something to share? Call the show live at 877-757-9424.
All right, we're back and talk a little bit about the sadly but ongoing debate about communion in the hand versus communion in the tongue. And I think those of us, now, you can have a preference. There is an option. I mean, this is what the law says, all right? Whether you should have an option and so on, that's a different question. Currently, adults, or anyone who receives communion is free to receive on the tongue or in the hand. There's additional questions about kneeling and standing and so on that, again, I think it's clear the Vatican has reiterated many times that if a person has a right to kneel if they want to as well. Now, we've had some bishops recently sort of, I don't know, sort of just be dismissive of people who either receive communion kneeling or receive communion on the tongue. I think Cardinal Supik had a rather he wrote a letter basically saying that Catholics shouldn't do that because it disrupts the flow of communion and so on and so on. Kneeling, that is to say, receiving kneeling. Recently, there is an article here in the Catholic World Report that Archbishop Bruno Forte, who is the archbishop in Italy, has shall we say, he was actually just kind of nasty to people who receive on the tongue. This is from Peter Stravinskas, who wrote the article, Father Peter Stravinskas. I was stunned to read of your recent attack, Archbishop, on those who receive Holy Communion on the tongue. Even more so because you used an Easter homily to launch that assault, which demonstrates an amazing lack of pastoral sensitivity. I suspect that if one of your priests had preached against those who receive in the hand, you would probably suspend him. Anyway, that said, permit me to react to your line of argumentation. You say that the reception of the tongue began, quote, in the dark ages, unquote, because people had, quote, dirty hands, unquote, but that are now much more hygienic and should, on that score, we should receive in the hand. You also say that the laity are not children anymore, about which I'll comment further, he says. So those who would say the communion on the tongue, which was the venerable practice of the church for at least a millennia, if not going further back than that, were in the Dark Ages, and that they were they were acting like children. They weren't being treated like adults. And this is a terrible thing to say, to assault the Catholic teaching and so on. It goes on to say, Peter Stravinsky writes here, your harangue then asserts that those receiving Holy Communion on the tongue are guilty of the sins of pride and disobedience. Because popes and bishops have mandated reception in the hand. They have not mandated it, brothers and sisters. But again, this is what the archbishop there suggested, that they had mandated reception on the hand, which is patently false, okay? In point of fact, liturgical law calls for reception on the tongue, and that if one wants to receive in the hand, the bishops of that diocese or region must get an indul, which means a reluctant permission, basically. Now, as a favor to you, I should like to present the accurate account of history. It goes on to say that it is true that in some places and times, under certain circumstances in the ancient church, the communion in the hand was something that was done, and that there's going to be a some, but it was under certain circumstances and so on, but that it was rather quickly abandoned, and we might want to ask, why was it abandoned? You see. And then also he goes on to say the next time this ever came up was at the Protestant Reformation, where they insisted, trying to downplay the true presence and transubstantiation, that communion should be received by the hands, one self-communicated, and so on. So again, this was the Council of Trent had to fight against that watering down. So again, we'll get back to this. We do have a call, though. I like to give some priority to the calls, so perhaps...
Yeah, Monsignor, we have a Carl from Dallas on the line, and he wants to comment on the next pope, and I think maybe even connection to what you're talking about St. Peter.
Cool. So
go ahead, Carl.
Monsignor, I have to say I love your show and love your point of view, and appreciate your ministry. The point that you made about Peter I thought was outstanding, in the sense that this has been true in my own life, is that when you come with honesty, you can come with weakness, faults, failures, sins, but if we come with honesty to the Lord and to those of us that are, our friends, we can make progress. But if we don't, we really can't. And I think this is something that bothered me about the last papacy and about the whole curial apparatus, was that we'd see one thing kind of like, in other words, they wouldn't change the letter.
Yeah.
But yet there was enough ambiguity and a wink and a wink and a nod that the people in the field, the message was, do what you need to do, do what you think is right, even if it's against the rules.
Yeah.
So really, we were getting the disingenuousness of like, well, we're reacting to the needs of the people. We're reacting to, the flock and the smell of the flock. Well, a lot of the flock wanted the Latin Mass, and was really, a lot of the flock received enormous spiritual blessing from the older rite and some of the older rubrics. God bless them. I mean, why not let them, with the other rites of the church, of which there are many, why not let that coexist? Why not let that flourish? Yeah. So I really would like to see less disingenuous double talk and dishonesty, and just more integrity. Hear what you say about that.
Yeah, no, I certainly would say that your points are well taken. I think you're right. There was a sort of a twofold thing that seemed to be going on. There was weaponized ambiguity. And I mean, it was weaponized. I think a lot of it was intentional. Kind of like you say, a wink, wink, and a nod, especially when it came to like a Amoris Laetitia. That was the first, trotting out of that. So the Pope said, well, it's just a footnote. Don't worry about it. And then he gives an affirmation to the Argentinian bishops and their approach, and that he didn't give to the Polish bishops, who had the opposite conclusion. And so you start to play favorites. And that's the second part that you mentioned, that You look, you can do what you want, so unless it's the traditional Latin Mass or some other little thing on a short list that are just things that you just, todos, we were told. Everyone is welcome, except, people who like the old form of the Mass, or who aren't so sure about climate change being the biggest deal of all, and there's a little sort of a list or an agenda that you dare not offend, but otherwise totus, totus, totus. And the ones who seemed to get favor were those who were openly dissenting on the Church's teachings on sexuality and to some degree liturgy, on other aspects. So it was obviously a lot of whiplash and a very confusing time for Catholics. And how hard we tried early on to say, well, I'm sure the Pope doesn't really mean that. And we're just never, and as I say, Francis had good things. Pope Francis had good things too, but it's been trying. And I understand. I agree, understand, and I can just basically affirm what you've said as well. Okay.
Thank you.
All right, bless your heart. Thanks. Thanks for calling. Okay, well, just to return, I think, to this other thing, which is a little bit also an attack on tradition. This particular, or this open letter that Father Stravinskas is writing against Archbishop Bruno Forte, and he's, by the way, he's a Chieti Vasto. I don't know all the different names of the diocese there, but he's well known in Italy, and he's very dismissive, calls people guilty of pride and so on if they want to receive on the tongue. He says that communion in the hand is meant to treat people like adults. You don't put food in an adult's mouth, and so on, et cetera, et cetera. And it's just, once again, this idea of being very dismissive. But when there's an option, and both should be honored. Now, I personally prefer, and I would like to see us go back to communion on the tongue kneeling. That said, I'm not going to say that my parishioners you're flawed and you're not as pious as somebody who receives kneeling and on the tongue. I'm not going to say that because I don't know that. And I'm not going to berate or deride people who receive in the hand. Many were taught this way and for various reasons feel more comfortable, and it's currently an option. So why take this stance that the Archbishop did? Is it simply, is everybody who receives on the tongue, Archbishop, is just holier than thou, full of pride? I know the white ready to receive. Maybe there's some people who say, I'm going to show you how it's done. But other people actually have a real devotion. They might actually all believe all that stuff. This is the Lord, and I'm going to come before him kneeling and humbly. And I am a child of God. I may be an adult here on this earth, but we're all God's children, and so what's wrong with, having the Eucharist, shall we say, given to us on the tongue rather than in our hand, and where we kind of more literally take it. What's that all about? I mean, so as long as there's an option, let's stop accusing the other side or whatever, and let's also return, though, I think, let's have mutual respect. And even if I can say to you, I think it was a mistake to introduce communion in the hand, I'm going to honor it as an option. And I think that's where I would stand. I don't know, Matthew, what you think, but...
Yeah, it's something I'm a little opinionated on. I receive on the tongue. I love receiving on the tongue. During the COVID interruption, they made us wait at the end of the communion line, before anyone could receive on the tongue. So that was like a little bit of like a slap on the hand, a little bit.
Yeah.
But I have to say, and I try not to watch people when they receive communion, but I can't help but notice that I think communion on the tongue is on the rise. Mm-hmm. I would say maybe 15 years ago, I almost never saw it except at a traditional parish. But now it's becoming more and more common. And, I do it for two reasons. One is because I'm honoring our Lord and because I do fully believe. But two, I'm really convinced that many more particles end up on the ground when they end up in people's hands than when it goes directly into their mouth. And it was very interesting the other week when I was in Miami and I went to Easter Mass at a parish that was not my own. They gave this, really good talk about, who is allowed to receive communion and who is not allowed to receive. Because is it Easter and people have come back and people may not know. But it was very appropriate. But then there was this whole second part of their sort of explanation that says, you have to consume it right there. You can't take it from the church. You can't feed it to your pet. These, kind of like things that I hadn't really even heard of. And so I was wondering if it was, like if witchcraft was on the rise in this particular area, or if the, Santeria or some sort of, voodoo religion down where, in that particular area where they, maybe people are taking the host. So, communion in the mouth is much less likely anyone is going to be able to just take it, and kind of sneak it, and I found it in the, in the pew where they have that little holder for the books. I've found a host there before, and it breaks my heart. Yeah. So there's other reasons just in the reverence factor of why this is a good practice, I think. And like you say, both are allowed, so let's just allow it.
Yeah. And that's the thing, too. In my own parish, I have a double kneeler in the center section of the church that I bring out for those who do want to receive kneeling, and on the tongue, or just kneeling and on the hand. Some people kneel and they receive on the hand, so you get a little bit of both. But I can say that the main ones who kneel are young adults. We baby boomers, we old folks, you don't do all that. But it's mostly the young adults. So here we go again. Why? So to the Archbishop and to others, please, why berate people who love tradition? It's a growing segment in the church, and let's see where the Holy Spirit leads us, and don't stop being so mean. Okay. When we come back, we're going to talk about transgenderism, sadly, but we're going to talk about it when we return.
This is Franciscan Media's Saint of the Day for May 2nd. Today we celebrate Saint Athanasius. Born in Egypt to Christian parents, Athanasius received a classical education before entering the priesthood. As Bishop of Alexandria, Egypt, he suffered numerous exiles for the crime of defending the divinity of Jesus. Arianism, the 4th century heresy that denied the divinity of Christ, was in full bloom. Though Athanasius was an outspoken critic, Arianism continued to prosper. Following various allegations, some of them personal, the Emperor Constantine had Athanasius exiled to France in the year 335. When the emperor's son came to power, he restored Athanasius, but the bishop would be banished 4 more times for various reasons. Vicious campaigns against Athanasius continued throughout much of his life. During one period, Athanasius was able to enjoy 10 years of relative peace. He took the opportunity to read, write, and promote monastic ideals. Among his writings, a biography of St. Anthony of Egypt achieved astonishing popularity. It contributed greatly to the establishment of monastic life throughout the Western Christian world. Athanasius died in 373. In 1568, he was proclaimed a doctor of the Church. There's more about the saints, along with inspiration and Catholic resources, at our website, saintoftheday.org. From Franciscan Media, this has been Saint of the Day.
This is The Quest from the studios of the Guadalupe Radio Network. Share the show with a friend. You can find us on social media. Want to listen again? We're on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, the free Guadalupe Radio app, or wherever you enjoy listening to podcasts.
All right, we are back. We're beginning, I think we've kind of gone over the hill, thanks be to God, I think, in this transgenderism craziness, especially what we do to children, for heaven's sakes, who can't possibly know enough or to consent or make rightful requests for major changes that will affect their entire life. So again, there's an HHS, the Department of Health and Human Services, released a sweeping 400-page report on Thursday that warns of serious long-term health risk associated with subjecting children to so-called gender-affirming care. There is going to be, they say physical as well as psychological harm. Now, Let me just maybe preface what I read further. Back when I was about 10 years of age, I had double pneumonia, and it came from because I had been in a swimming team, and I just ingested too much pool water, I think, and all those hours and hours of swimming. But that scarred my lungs, and for the rest of my life, I've had a lot of strong tendency to pulmonary problems. Sometimes when things happen to you when you're young, it's much more multiplied, the problems. Now, for example, one of our great saints, Saint Bernadette of Subaru, she lived in great poverty, barely had enough food. But a lot of people don't know this, but she was all of like 4'6". She almost appeared to be a little girl when she would walk in. Who's that little girl? That's Bernadette. But that was because of malnutrition, and she also had issues that plagued her all her life. She lived not too long, actually, but she had terrible problems she had tuberculosis and all the empathy, all that kind of stuff that afflicted her the rest of her life. So when you have something like this when you're young, you're going to find that there's huge ongoing effects because things that need to be developing when you're a kid aren't. So we see here that the HHS report states that highlights a growing body of evidence that point to significant risk, including irreversible harm such as infertility, and they found only very weak evidence of any benefits. The weakness has been a consistent finding of systematic reviews around the world. Now, do we need to go to medical school to say, to try to block puberty is a good thing for your health and the development of your body? Or do we need, what medical school do you need to go to find out that, this is an important stage of development that affects everything, not just, sexuality, but your bone structure, your overall health and well-being, and all, it's all intersected with this stuff. And to say that we're going to just put hormones in these kids that have profound effects and then other things to try to block puberty and think they're going to end up healthy physically? Obviously, fertility is going to be a problem, but more than that, they can often have weak, kind of osteo, all kinds of issues related to these things that are very important in those growing years that we develop good, strong bodies. And the idea of interfering with puberty or trying to block or delay it is just, I can't imagine how anyone thinks that's healthy. So I don't know. What do you, Matthew, help me out here. I'm out on the edge again here.
Yeah, well.
How can anybody think like that?
I don't know, but it's so refreshing that the Health and Human Services is finally addressing something like this because it, like you say, it's not just sexuality, it's, bone structure and general development. And, I like that the executive order that Trump put forward actually used the word like mutilation in its descriptive title because it's, you got to say things that what they are, and there's no reason to be doing these things to children. It's so inappropriate and heartbreaking that I'm glad it feels like we're moving in the right direction here and using science, right? We're like, we heard for so many years, trust the science. Well, the science really shows that there is no real medical benefit from any of these so-called gender-affirming treatments, right? And some people,
so-called suicide rates are about the same.
They're the same, and sometimes it's worse because the kids think that this is going to fix all their problems, and when it doesn't fix all their problems, then they lose some sort of hope. And then there's the kids who have no medical treatment whatsoever, and then in 3 years they've said, well, "Yeah, I was confused about this," and they go on to live a healthy and normal life. So. We want people to live healthy and normal lives and live the lives that God created for them. So,
yeah. Just you were quoting, they're mentioning this already, but here's a quote from the Protecting Children executive order that the president signed. Across the country today, it says medical professionals are maiming and sterilizing a growing number of impressionable children under the radical and false claim that adults can change a child's sex through a series of irreversible medical interventions. And this is a dangerous trend, and it will be a stain on our nation's history. It must now end. Well said. This is a stain. How did they get that confused? future people. They how did they get that confused? You know, you may remember some years ago, Matthew, there was a big fuss about, and rightfully so, about this genital mutilation, they called it, in the Muslim world.
Oh, yeah, of course.
And we don't want to get too descriptive here, but it basically involved some sort of a kind of a female circumcision that was performed, and it was argued that it would keep them more chaste because it would take away pleasure and so on. I don't want to get into the details, except that it was rightfully denounced. And they said, well, the young girls, when they're told about these things, they actually are happy about it. This is part of a rite of passage. And, you know, in other words, they're okay with it. Well, I'm sorry, a kid who's 12 or 13 years old they don't know they're okay. This is the kind of stuff that, you know, we can't take advantage of children. Now, I know that we sort of tuck up against the problem of parental authority, but in our country, we've had some limits to that. If a parent was rejecting necessary medical interventions and so on, that there are some ways that we can adjudicate that in the court. As a general rule, yeah, parents can have, you know, some authority, but when it comes to literally changing their son or daughter's body, but through surgeries, cutting off or cutting away at properly functioning organs and so on, I think we rightfully protest and say that's parental rights that have gone too far. We have to protect children from sometimes from their parents' stupidity as well. And so again, we have to, I think, just realize that this horrible section, I hope of our history is beginning to come to an end, and we'll see it for the monstrous thing it was, and wonder, how did we ever get that confused? Well, I'll tell you how we got that confused. It all goes back to a little decision that there's no necessary connection between having sex and having children. Yep. And that's called the contraceptive mentality. And once you start to just say, well, sex is about whatever I say it is, you start to get weird. And you start to start approving of all kinds of unnatural acts and things like this, and that offend against the purpose of human sexuality. And it'll be, to use a food analogy, you know, there's a lot of pleasure associated with food. It tastes good and so on. We also sometimes have camaraderie or friendship when we eat with other people. But at the end of the day, food is basically about nutrition. So if I were to say, well, let's all eat several meals, what we'll do is we'll all eat the one meal, and then we'll all go out and throw it up in the backyard, and then we'll come back in for the next one, and then we'll throw it up, and people will be horrified. Because again, food isn't just about pleasure or just about something. Its ultimate purpose is for nutrition and calories. And so you can say there's other things that go along with it, pleasures and things like this, but at the end of the day, it's basically about nutrition and calories. Now, that's the same thing we've done with sexuality. You see, we said, well, it doesn't have to be about having kids, and it can be just, you know, having fun or pleasure, or, you know, but it's ultimately still about that. But when you start to deny that, you start to get weird in your thinking, and we see where the sexual revolution has led us. You know, how many people are addicted to pornography, how many people are just lost in sexual confusion, and then this weird transgenderism thing comes and so on. Well, time to wrap it up. But my brothers and sisters, keep praying for that thing to just go away and never return. Pray also now for our church going through a period of great change, and let's pray for a good outcome. And may Almighty God bless you all, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
The joy of Easter extends beyond the day itself, encouraging us to live in the light of the resurrection every day. This is the Guadalupe Radio Network, radio for your soul.
Mount St. Michael Catholic School is deeply committed to training children in courageous virtue grounded in the truth of Christ. Your children can join us for daily Mass, a preschool Montessori, and 1st through 8th grade classical curriculum. This